We're following up this morning on the homicide that occurred at Utah Valley University of Charlie Kirk 2 days ago. We know that last night and then this morning there was a press conference related to an individual who is now in jail in the Utah County Jail on suspicion of murder. That's Tyler James Robinson, 22 years old. Governor Cox spoke this morning about what they had found about him in terms of his radicalization or him becoming more and more political over the years.
When encountered in person by investigators in Washington County on September 12th in the early morning hours, Robinson was observed in consistent clothing with those surveillance images. Investigators interviewed a family member of Robinson who stated that Robinson had become more political in recent years. The family member referenced a recent incident in which Robinson came to dinner prior to September 10th, and in the conversation with another family member, Robinson mentioned Charlie Kirk was coming to UVU. They talked about why they didn't like him and the viewpoints that he had. The family member also stated Kirk was full of hate and spreading hate. The family member also confirmed Robinson had a gray Dodge Challenger.
That was important because that was one of the pieces of evidence that they got from their surveillance footage. But, you know, we have so many questions, and we have on the line with us Dr. Hans Watson. He's the owner of Dynamic Psychiatry, and he's been a forensic psychiatrist, as somebody who evaluates people for court and has expertise on how to evaluate shooters like this. Welcome, Dr. Watson.
Thank you for having me.
And any time, Doctor, you have a case like this, it would behoove the defense, and really the state for that matter, to have some level of evaluation done. And can you just tell our listeners what that looks like at the outset?
Yeah, so the evaluation that you're doing is really quite simple in understanding, but there's, of course, many nuances to do it. But the evaluation is going to just look at two different things, and that is, did they understand right and wrong at the time of the alleged crime? And we call that competency. And then the second part is, do they have the capacity to aid in their own defense when they're going to trial? And so those are the two general things that happen. Of course, there are many tools and nuances to doing that evaluation, but those are the two big things. Did you know right and wrong, and can you aid in your own defense? And that's where the insanity defense would be used.
Look, my question, I think, is probably one that most of the country has, is how do people like this alleged shooter and a number of others, how do they become radicalized?
That's a great question. We actually have the data that tells us that. There's been some wonderful studies that have been done over the years. There's books written on it. And then you can look at all of them. And so we know it's a 4-step process that causes somebody to become this way. And one of the good things that has come out of this is there is this false narrative that makes it much more scary for the rest of the population that this was just somebody who had a mental health situation and they snapped and they are out of touch with reality to what's happening. And that is just not accurate. It has been thoroughly proven that is completely inaccurate, does not happen. But these people who are shooters, these are long, planned out, calculated things, and most don't even meet criteria for a mental health diagnosis. So the first thing people can do is put it to rest that you're going to be in danger if this is mental health. Instead, if you understand the 4-step process that creates these individuals, you can do something about it, because if you intervene at any one of these 4 steps, you can prevent it from happening, period. And the FBI has teams that are excellent at that. So the 4 steps are, first, you need to be in a position where you're raised, where you don't understand appropriate roles, meaning you don't understand different levels of authority. There is confusion in the home where you're raised to understanding that parents have different authority than children. Children are peers to each other. One doesn't get to be in charge of the other. And then the child role, understanding that you're subordinate. So that's the first step, is you have to confuse that to where there isn't a clear distinction between parent, peer, and child.
Doctor, before you move on from that first step, does that also include roles outside of the home? For example, your school teacher, law enforcement,
Exactly.
other people?
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. And what we say when we're talking about the psychology behind it is your boss at work really takes a parent role, and you take a child role or subordinate role. When you're in school, your friends at school are in a peer role. And so there's really those three. And so the nickname parent applies to anybody who's in an authority position. Child would apply to anybody who's in that subordinate position. And peer would be somebody who has equal authority.
Okay, so I'm wondering how this even equates to being radicalized, but I guess you're going to get to that one.
Yeah.
Step.
Steps 2, 3, and 4, right.
Yeah. So the second step is once you've confused that authority, generally that allows the child to not be able or not learn to deal with adversity or challenges in life. And this gets really difficult because a lot of our learning growing up comes when we are challenged. That's when we're forced to look at other perspectives. That's when we're forced to learn how to compromise and engage in healthy conflict resolution skills. That's when we learn that consequences matter, so I better think before I act. And so that adversity, not being forced to learn to A, recognize what your challenges are, and B, work through them is going to be that second step. So we nickname this many times a helicopter parent would be the second step, where they stop them from having to deal with difficulty or challenges.
Wow, that's interesting. Doctor, can you stay on with us over our next break? We want to get to steps 3 and 4, of course.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll be right back.
The new Inside Sources.
I want to follow up with our conversation with Dr. Hans Watson, a psychiatrist who does forensic evaluations for people who have court proceedings pending against them. And we're talking about this idea of how young people, especially young people, get radicalized. And he talked about a 4-step process. Step 1 being a sort of a generalized confusion about authority and
right.
who's in charge.
Who's the boss of who?
Right. And step 2, not dealing with challenges in life, the failure to deal with those things and not recognizing them.
Yeah. All right. So what's number 3?
So once we've done that, an inability to deal with challenges, one of the big things that comes with dealing with challenges is the ability to self-reflect. And that is going to lead us to step 3, which is in order to make sense of the world where you're not willing to self-reflect and see your part in things because that would be a challenge to look yourself in the mirror, they create a worldview that is based on imaginary attacks by outside people or things. And this is where it deviates. If you didn't create that, maybe you'd go into an eating disorder, or maybe you'd go into a depressive disorder. But if you start saying, I am being attacked by outside things and people, that is where you now start entering the danger zone for becoming radicalized, because you have to create this imaginary narrative of how your struggles in life are due to other people wronging you, not because you don't know how to act with a peer and not boss them around because you learned how to be in charge. Instead, you must have wronged me. I'm uncomfortable. It must be your fault. And so they start to create these narratives. And when there is something that is reality-based that challenges that, you actually have to go even deeper into your imagination and create it. This is what they will actually call, eventually develops into narcissism, where you believe in something that there just isn't reality to back. And that's your third step, is you have to engage in imaginary, emotion-based realities that are not backed by what we see in the real world.
And what you're describing is personalized to the individual, not necessarily you're attacking our country or you're breaking down the framework of our country. It's there, you're looking at it as you are personally being attacked by the individual.
Well, it could be both, because some people, they are so afraid of looking themselves in the mirror that they will take on an identity of my country, and patriotism is my identity. And so you can see how that could bleed into many areas if you're displacing your focus off of yourself and onto some external source or object. And so it could be any of them, but it will be very different with each individual of what they choose.
Yeah.
And then
sorry, can I just ask you more questions about this? Because this one, it sounds like what I used to hear about, a persecution complex, right? I mean, maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but how do you get people to, A, recognize that that's happening, and B, interrupt that cycle? Because if you're
wonderful.
Oh, Well, thank
You're
you.
wonderful. You're hitting the nail on the head, and this is exactly. I actually have a training institute where I train therapists, and this is exactly what I give them 3 weeks of training on how to interrupt this cycle and how to do it without causing these people to become so distressed that they're going to become violent. We call it narcissistic rage. And so it's quite nuanced, but the oversimplification is you teach them that it's safe to self-reflect. That is the single biggest tool that we utilize. And remember, if you interrupted any one of these steps, you prevent somebody from becoming a shooter. And so there's a lot of hope for people who are trained to do this.
All right, so walk us through step 4.
The step 4 is now, if you've done this, you are terrified of being forgotten and seen as insignificant in life. And so if you are of the right persuasion there and your way of doing it, you are now going to choose to say, I'm going to do something that, A, stops you from introducing ideas that are backed by fact that destroy the whole imaginary world I've created. You're destroying my whole way, and I'd have to look at myself and B, if I do it through a way that is public and in a time where you cannot fight back. The shooters are all very much proven over the years to be extreme cowards, but their whole goal, unconsciously, many of them, is to not be forgotten. And so that fear of being forgotten is step 4. And so they'll do something to where they can now be famous as the shooter, or the person who did this. They're never going to forget me. In fact, there's a whole cult that follows the Columbine High kids because they want to be just like them, and they tend to be individuals who follow these 4 steps, and they're saying, I don't want to be forgotten. And the intervention teams that the FBI actually trains to do this, they train them, and it's common that they will intervene with these kids before they become shooters, and they'll be wearing the exact same clothing that the Columbine High kids did in an attempt to say, you won't forget me the same way that I didn't forget those 2 loners from Columbine.
Let me just take a pivot, and maybe it's not a pivot, Dr. Watson. What's with the manifestos or the writing something on the bullet casing, like here comes, catch this fascist or something like that? I mean, does that? Yeah. Maybe that's not even related, but it seems to be another.
No, it's completely related. You're completely related because now I've given you something to remember me by. This is what you all can talk about now so that I will forever be famous. Is maybe there's not anything else about me, so if I write something important on a bullet, that's the thing you'll remember, and you'll always make sure I am not forgotten and alone.
So what kind of warning signs, especially on this step 4, would you have? Would you start to have somebody start talking about, I don't want to be forgotten, or what kind of indicators might there be for people around them?
Yeah, generally we don't hear people, they're not generally able to express that because part of being able to express yourself is learning to work through adversity. And so they're not able to express that. So instead we look for things like, are they somebody who is incredibly unable to connect and recognize social norms? And so a lot of the interventions we'll do there are we help them to learn social norms in a safe place, like a therapy environment where they can start to say, oh, I didn't mean to push people away. Wait, the rest of society thinks this is offensive, whereas for me it's not something I learned to be offensive. So we start teaching basic social skills. It's actually one of the biggest interventions that we can do. And then teaching them to self-reflect, hands down, the most powerful thing is for them to learn to say, oh, there's another perspective on this, and they don't have to accept it, and they don't have to reject it. They just have to develop that skill. And if they develop that skill of self-reflection, we tend to see the threat drop drastically.
Doctor, I want to talk to you just generally and not with respect to this case because I don't want to blame family or anyone involved with this situation. But what is it that parents and friends often overlook and don't see as this radicalization continues through these processes, through these steps?
The single biggest thing is that role confusion, that not understanding appropriate authority levels and the downstream effects that it has in the people's lives. It's that right there is the single biggest cause. If we could eliminate that, we probably would eliminate 70 or 80% of the problems we have with people that are struggling with social connection as well as our prison systems. And so that role confusion is just an epidemic.
And how would you see that? Just tell us how you would articulate what that looks like.
Well, do you? It would be really simple. I would actually say, is the principle understood that if you are going to receive assistance or resources from somebody or someone, do you recognize that you are trading your independence and authority in exchange for that help? If you can say, yeah, that makes perfect sense, we know that you had good training in role confusion. And if you can't, and you're saying, why should the bank be able to tell me that I have to work a job just to get a loan? Then I know, hey, there's some role confusion that you're going to be struggling with here because you don't understand. You have to train your autonomy of whether you work or not in order to obtain that loan. And the bank has the authority because they're providing that resource. And that would tell me this person is somebody I have to work with on role confusion and authority.
That is so fascinating. Thank you for this conversation. And I think I'm going to tell my adult children that I did them a favor by being the boss of them while they were growing up.
That was actually really interesting. And how I practiced law for 43 years and didn't understand that, I don't know. But thanks again, Dr.
Really,
Watson.
really super interesting. Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to continue our conversation, but we've been speaking all morning about the arrest of a suspect in the shooting and killing of Charlie Kirk. His name is Tyler Robinson. He's from Washington County. He's 22 years old. He's currently booked in the Utah County Jail. He has not been formally charged yet, but I've learned from you, Greg, that they have, I think, 72 hours. Right, not counting weekends, something like that.
Yeah. So they have the governor said 3 days, which is exactly right. But Saturdays and Sundays don't count toward that.
Right,
3 days,
but I don't think they're going to wait necessarily to charge him.
But
on
they probably
these
don't
counts.
need to. But on the other hand, I don't think a judge will release him in the meantime. If the state says we need 5 days, we need 10 days, he's not going anywhere. And they could probably charge him with one of the lesser crimes just to keep him held. But the aggravated murder is the big ticket item.